Welcome to Nanog's Internet Innovators, a series that allows you to learn more about some of the brightest and boldest tech minds of our time. Join us as we look to the past, present, and future of the internet and talk to the innovators who are actually there. Every month, we will be interviewing Internet Innovators who revolutionize the internet as we know it. Watch as we host conversations with those that are building the internet of tomorrow. Welcome, Geoff Huston. I'm so excited to talk to you today. I'm going to formally introduce you. You are the Chief Scientist at APNIC, the regional internet registry serving the Asia-Pacific region. You've closely been involved with the development of the internet for many years, particularly within Australia, where you led the effort of the initial deployment of the internet in Australia. You've also worked for the largest Australian communications service provider, Telstra, in senior engineering, architecture, and research roles, assisting with the large-scale deployment of the internet across Australia and as a transit service provider in the Asia-Pacific region. You are the author of a number of internet-related books and were a member of the Internet Architecture Board from 1999 to 2005, as well as chairing a number of working groups in the Internet Engineering Tasking Force. But more informally, you may be known as the most friendly yet depressing Internet Hall of Famer. Geoff, you are very comfortable with addressing the elephant in the room when others are not. Why is this?
Well, I suppose I did have a background in being taught how to speak and how to debate years ago. But I don't know, there's something more than this. And I grew up in an era of the telephone companies where technology was kind of written in granite and handed down as kind of immutable reality. And what I find so amazing and impressive about the technology of the internet is that it's a conversation. It's not fixed. It's what we build and how we build it. And so there are successes, there are abysmal failures, and there's a whole lot in between. And, you know, we've got to be honest with ourselves. Some things have worked remarkably well beyond our wildest expectations. The BGP routing protocol, 30 years old and still doing an amazing job. It's now running at a scale 1 billion times bigger than its design. Fantastic. IPv6, well, call it like it is. A long-term, protracted train wreck. And, all of our expectations of rapid deployment have disappeared in the mists of time. And we're now setting records of how long we can dance on this knife edge, being, a little bit of V6, a little bit of not V6 forever. And I must admit, I enjoy pointing this out. It's just a whole bunch of fun to see where our failures have happened just as much as our successes.
What influences as a kid growing up in Australia made you the man you are today?
Oh, God. Australia and America, particularly in the sort of suburbia areas, are not all that much different. There is a certain degree of, I suppose, isolationism in Australia. We are a small rock at the bottom of the South Pacific Ocean. And in some ways, it always feels like the important things are happening elsewhere. But I think a lot of folk feel that all over the world. And so there was this constant pressure to sort of keep in touch and try and sort of get currency. But I don't know, you keenly felt that only the privileged and the elite were allowed to travel. Plane tickets were expensive. You couldn't just jump on a plane and go to meetings. And that took a long time to sort of change. And so with a technology like the internet that took this kind of video call, $1,000 a minute in the 1980s, today, free. And you have to admit, that's astonishingly liberating and connecting. And I must admit, I found that even, in my, I suppose it was late 20s, early 30s when I took this job on of building it. Part of the excitement was this excitement of connecting, this excitement of sort of breaking down a whole bunch of barriers that existed, certainly in Australia, for more than 100 years. And it's life-changing. Honestly, for so many people in this country, it makes us feel part of somewhere else as much as part of the country. And for folk in those kind of isolated communities, we're speaking, if you will, the wrong language in the wrong part of the globe. Culturally, we're somewhere between England and America, the middle of the Atlantic, but, physically we're not. To change that with technology is just amazing. It is just so liberating in the people, the friendships, the work you can do that, I think it's worthwhile just pausing and contemplating for a second. This change is as big, if not bigger, for the world than the Industrial Revolution. It is just an astonishing change. And I frankly find that so exciting, it's not funny.
I read that you weren't allowed to watch TV as a kid growing up in Australia, and your love of books and words pioneered your career. Can you talk more about this?
You've caught me. Yeah, television was introduced in Australia in the year I was born. But my father was a staunch traditionalist. I think like most kids born in the boomers, our parents were both farm kids, and they moved to the city. And I think a lot of people my age had that same experience. And he was not a television fan. So our entertainment was indeed books. And I was a keen reader, still am in some ways. And so, yes, I read deeply and widely across all kinds of subjects. I kind of fostered an eclectic interest in all kinds of bizarre and wonderful things about our past, science, technology, and maths. It did shape me. I didn't realise that was on record somewhere. But yeah, I'm not a television kid.
What kind of things did you do differently in life to lead you down this path of thinking differently? Like, what made you comfortable in this space?
There's an odd combination of being confident in public speaking and being comfortable with technology that doesn't happen with many. If anyone was privileged enough to hear Marshall Rose speak, I loved to listen to him. It was just a pleasure because he too understood how to actually make an impactful talk to a room full of geeks. Because most of us, if we're left to our own inclinations, are typical what we call shoe shufflers. We're introverted. We stare down at our shoes. What's happening on the screen is far more important than what's happening in real life. And, that's part of the makeup of what kind of personality just absolutely falls in love with technology and this idea of automated systems creating massive, towers of possibility. Speaking about it is almost a different brain frame. It's just a different way of thinking. And, I was so impressed that some folk were able to do it. I spent some time trying to understand, how do you do engagement with an audience? How do you sort of stand up and make people look up from their laptop screens? And, if you can say something sufficiently outlandish that you get half the room looking up with their eyebrows headed to the ceiling, you've made it. You've actually managed to connect and start to engage with folk. My first impression was to actually get folk to. Sorry, that's my phone going ding at me. My first effort was to try and get folk to look without having to turn off the Wi-Fi in the room or anything like that. You've got to kind of pick it up. Vint Cerf too is another excellent public speaker, and in some ways, speaking and being able to speak and speak about the technology is just so important, so important. Once I took into that role, I kind of found it was helpful. It was helpful to me, but it was helpful to others as well to actually truly get into this understanding that this is not some weird rocket scientist, 20 years to get the grip of things. Most of this stuff is insanely simple. And it's just kind of getting over this sort of barrier of, it's technology, it's ones and zeros, this is all too hard. And actually going, well, it's not really. It's just, someone else's thoughts. And we're just spreading these thoughts around and talking about them because some of them are good bits and some are not so good bits. Let's try and make the not so good bits less evil and try and see if we can make the good bits work better. And that's sort of what's motivated me.
Geoff, that was actually one of the reasons I really liked you. I was reading a lot of your stuff and watching you, and I was like, I can stay engaged with this and I can understand. And I was thinking how rare that is that a tech person can blur that line of being a public speaking and making this information more accessible, because at the end of the day, we're all internet consumers. So we have to kind of make this accessible information. We have to be able to understand.
And it's part of the trying to speak to an extremely broad audience. And like, I've seen incredibly detailed technical talks. And the issue is it's such a low-level conversation. There's about two other people in the room who are actually keeping pace with what you're saying, because everyone else, you've kind of dived all the way down to the bottom of the sea and, picking up grains of sand. Part of the issue is to make that interesting, you've got to put it into context. You've got to try and explain why this is important, what aspects of this really could help, and, why you should pay attention to the critical bits of the talk without necessarily worrying about some bits and bytes. And so those kinds of talks that try and uplift into the reason why this is important are actually talks that I think make a difference, because they also get other folk appreciating why this is an interesting topic, what is interesting about it, and what bits, if you will, do we know and what bits don't we know. And if you can do all that in a talk and sort of get all ranges of audience sort of following you along, I think you've achieved the mission, whatever that might be. But most importantly, if you don't have fun, it shows. If you can't make a talk as fun to give as it is to listen, if you can't inject yourself into the talk, it just doesn't work. And so there's a lot of emotional energy in a lot of these talks, which I think is one of those things that it's hard for people to learn. But once you've got that knack and you enjoy the talk, folk enjoy listening, because it's kind of an emotional statement that goes through that kind of says, this is really fun and exciting, and I want to share that fun and excitement with you because, it's just so cool. How could we possibly have thought of this? Is always one of these wonderful questions, isn't it?
I like it. It's always a good choice to have fun.
I remember doing a session at our South American counterparts, LACNIC, and their talks were in Spanish, and unfortunately I don't speak Spanish. And simultaneous translators have a problem that they're constantly trying with two language threads in their head. And when they do the translation, there's almost no intonation, no enthusiasm, no overtones of what's being said and why. It's just the words. And it's so draining to listen to that all day. It's just, wow. And part of the reason is you just can't follow it. And so this is why I think we enjoy having people to actually give presentations, and why we really enjoy it live, because that's what brings a talk to life. The facts are sort of, it's just the facts. And so I think that's why we enjoy going to these meetings. We're even prepared to cope with virtual meetings. Once it loses that spontaneity and liveliness, a whole bunch of that just dives down.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with that. That's so funny. It's like the human side of all this technical information, which can be dry. You're right. Like, why not just listen to Google Talk instead of, but it does give that human spirit to it, right? Which we need. In an October 2020 article in ZDNet in a column called The Full Tilt, you apologize for bringing the internet to Australia, saying, quote, the internet is a gigantic vanity reinforcing distorted TikTok selfie, and web security is the punchline to some demented, sick joke. Why do you feel the internet is busted?
Oh, it's so broken, it's not funny. It's busted because, out there on the wires, it's so toxic it radiates in the dark. The amount of background traffic saturates real traffic. The amount of malware out there almost beggars description. Almost everything that we look at, that we talk about, is actually all about malware. Craig Leiboviz's recent talk at Nanog 82 sort of highlights this. There's so much of it. And part of the reason is, I think, what was originally an exciting venture in the academic and research domain about how to make computers talk, we made it really cheap and really easy. And then sort of cottoned onto, well, why doesn't everyone do this? And the answer was, well, yeah, let's do this. But then never quite figured out that it actually makes all kinds of things easy, including annoying other people, annoying other countries, annoying our infrastructure. And when you get to that scale, you start to worry about a few other things. There's been a lot of studies about how good we are as coders. And way, way back, I'm forgetting it was either Lockheed or Boeing or IBM, out of every 10 lines of code, there's one error all the time because we're people. And, people who write code don't necessarily write brilliant code. They code by the hour. And it happens with all kinds of skills, and all kinds of code is pretty cruddy. And so the base on which we've built this astonishing edifice is a base that's just disappointingly bad. And no matter where you look, you see exploits left, right, and centre. Now, in some ways, you kind of go, oh, well, it's just a little bit of email. It's not that bad a problem. But these days, the city's network traffic grid, our electricity system, our lives all rely on this infrastructure. And the problem is that foundation is astonishingly bad. I was appalled back in 2017 when someone managed to co-opt a few 100 million baby webcam monitors and turn them into the most vicious assault weapon that turned out, it made Dine on the East Coast flat on its back. And that basically turned off the infrastructure of the US East Coast flat on its back for hours. Those webcam baby cameras were still looking at the baby. They were still working just fine. But somehow we'd perverted them using some really basic slip-ups into being a vicious attack weapon. And that's not going to stop. And so, our ability to program well is way lower than our thought about how good we can program. We write lousy code. Most of us shouldn't be let near a keyboard. I admit it. I'm a terrible programmer. But I also admit, and this is the bit that you should get very worried about, I'm the same as everyone else. I really am. And that's the bit we haven't sort of managed to get over. And so, yes, these code bases are shocking and they keep on failing. The thing that makes it even more worrisome is that these days big is cheap. Fastly, Cloudflare, Akamai, Azure control most of the world's websites. So when Fastly has a minor problem with its content management framework, a huge amount of the world just goes blip. Akamai had a blip in this part of the world. Google has blips from time to time. And so if this was an aeroplane, we would have been grounded. The whole MAX 8 saga, the 737, all over again. But there's no one to do that. We're just let loose in this wonderful sort of playpen. And the toys that we're playing with are dangerous, but we're still allowed to play with them. And their ability to understand risks and failure just isn't there. So we should be worried. We should be worried that, we live by random luck, not by designed resilience. And part of the reason is the internet really succeeded because it was cheap. It didn't succeed because it was expensive. And it didn't succeed because it was strongly robust. It succeeded because it was cheap. And so now we're living with the consequence of building a world in a totally deregulated environment that's, cheap. And that has its risks. And I don't think we can fix this. And I look at the Internet of Things and, I deeply despair. It's bad, but we're going to make it bad by, 1,000,000 times worse. We're just going to populate the world with lousy silicon with cheap software. And then we're going to wonder why it all falls apart and becomes a vicious attack weapon just of unparalleled proportion. And so I enjoy pointing that out. And I kind of felt that rather than sitting and saying, yeah, what a great job we did on the internet, maybe it's worth pointing out that the job wasn't so great. And, we didn't really succeed that well in this. Whoops.
You are the man that's basically the saying, like, the emperor doesn't have clothes. Like, that's how I see you. It's just the guy that's like, hey, wait a second here. And I know engineers are problem solvers. And so usually, they're always looking for problems to solve. And so this goes in line with that. But it's amazing to me that, like, there isn't more of this voice out there.
You're dealing with a collective massive hysteria and delusion that extends to the fact that the 9 of the 10 largest publicly traded companies have all been built on these foundations of pretty lousy software. Pretty lousy insofar as poor old Apple that has a business case of trying to make sure that no one jailbreaks their iPhones. Yet every year, persistently, somebody finds yet another crack. So here's $1 trillion business whose major business is sealing up that phone so you can't break it, keeps on producing products that get broken. And it's not because they're bad at their job. They're good at their job. But the tools they're dealing with are fundamentally flawed because all the libraries that they include, all that sort of myriad of software written by other people who probably weren't paid for it, the whole sort of, if you will, fallacy of open source is such an astonishingly poor foundation to make these highly valuable companies. And in some ways, it's worth pointing out, this is a shaky tower. The foundations aren't solid, and we're investing at the top rather than worrying about how solid this is at the bottom. So, yeah, it's a problem. Someone's got to say it.
Absolutely. You may have already answered this, but I'm going to ask anyways. Now in summer 2021, we're headed at the beginning of July here, hopefully post-COVID. How have these thoughts evolved, or have they changed any since that 2020 article?
I think my evolution was way before that. In the 20 years before, I certainly had a much more rosier and optimistic view of the internet in 1990, when the real problem was the phone companies, and the real problem was they seemed like the behemoths of this industry that was sitting there preventing all kinds of innovation. All they were doing was just sucking money out of the system and try and prevent anyone else from being, if you will, inventive around computers and communication. And so we were trying to sort of break this down and say, look, they're gouging. They're actually squatting on technology and not releasing it. Who invented Unix? AT&T. The transistor, the modem. A whole lot of these core technologies came out of Bell Labs and the telephone industry, and none of them hit the mainstream. And they were the enemy. And we were sitting there going, the world could be so much different. But the reality that we've built kind of didn't meet that expectation either. That in turning this into a consumer technology and getting rid of all regulatory oversight, all direction, and letting the market rule has actually created this massive, vibrant marketplace of trying to beat the other person, to the point that I always remember Facebook's slogan of move fast and break things. And quite frankly, if the aeroplane industry ever took that to heart, you and I would not be buying airline seats. If the car industry took that to heart, you wouldn't buy a car, it would break. Yet somehow we can say this in our industry and seem like we're some kind of, great pioneer. These days, they're moving so fast. You and I as consumers are the beta testers. In fact, I think we're the alpha testers. Other industries were never allowed to be so cavalier. How did we manage to write a special license for ourselves to say, it's okay, it's technology, just leave us do all this crash testing work on consumers. It's okay, trust us. And, in some ways, we failed a conventional social contract. We failed to try and sort of curb some of these massive vaulting ambition in our thirst to corner someone else to a market. And we're leaving a lot of rubbish behind us that we can't control, and it is going to eat us. And, I kind of feel it's worth saying, because no one else is saying it. We actually sense in the regulatory environment, I spent some time working in the OECD, that governmental organization based in Paris, which has a strong interest in technology and public policy. And, the eye-opening sort of awareness is, if you go to that meeting, you actually find the regulators are as much at sea as consumers. They have very little idea of how to actually make sure that their users, their country, is actually well served by technology rather than being victims. And there's a real sense that they are being victimized. And their helplessness in trying to get out of that situation is evident. We've got to talk about this. I'm not sure it's solution land, but unless we talk about it, it just gets worse. And so, yes, these are deep things. These are, deep topics. But, we can have fun while we talk about it. It may be doomed, but at least we can smile as we go down.
So why are you so outspoken when others are looking the other way?
I have the luxury of working for an extremely tolerant employer. As an internet number registry, it's a very free space for folk like me. My employer's interests are actually about talking about infrastructure, talking about the underlying foundations of the internet, and trying to make sure that we do things deliberately, that we're aware of these things. That's a luxury that if I was working for a large vendor making applications or hardware, there'd be a certain amount of ouch. I remember working for Telstra where at some point all my presentations had to be approved by legals, and the basic answer was a curt email saying, you can't say that. And it's but it's true. And the answer was, well, you can't say that. And for me, I suppose it was deeply frustrating. But in APNIC these days, I don't get you can't say that. I certainly get some feedback saying, are you sure? And the real answer is, well, that's a good question. Am I sure? Am I confident about what I'm saying? And I suppose I've thought about it. I'm not saying it to entertain. I'm saying it because I think it's true. And I suppose being able to call that out is, like I said, a rare gift in this world of not having to toe a line where my employer would not like things being stated so blandly,
In that same ZDNet article, Malcolm Crompton, Australia's first privacy commissioner, actually called you an optimist and said, quote, we're not dealing with a data problem. We're not dealing with a privacy problem. We're dealing with a social issue. If we forget people, humanity, dignity, respect, freedom, all those wonderful words, then we're not heading in the right direction. What are your thoughts on this?
There are a whole bunch of problems. And yes, you could paint as dark a picture as you ever wanted to paint. There's been a lot of concern these days about personal privacy and the whole issue that these devices are way better at tracking each and every one of us individually than any technology we've ever invented in the past. And the sort of the scary fact was, or is, this is not state-based. This is actually commercial. This is private enterprises holding far more information than we've ever found in the past. There's the issue of the lack of regulatory oversight. In every country, non-citizens are aliens and enjoy no protection. If my personal data gets moved to any other regime, I'm just an alien. My data there has no protection. And the extent to which it's used, sold, leveraged against me, I don't know. I can't control. The extent to which my own individual decisions, which I always thought were mine, all the psychologists around the world who design shopping malls, who design online experiences, when the suggestion, seemingly innocent, is phrased in ways that are so insidiously pervasive, my fingers head to the buy button almost without a conscious thought. At what point have I been violated? At what point have I been coerced in ways that are so unconscious I could never have told? And this should worry us all, because in some ways, we always pride ourselves on being able to make our own decisions, on being able to evaluate and act as individuals rather than being just like the computers we operate, being an operated automaton ourselves, being coerced by folk who, if you will, do this for a living, using these same computer networks far more effectively, than we drive our own selves. And that's worth talking about. It's worth talking about to understand this. We're like in the Industrial Revolution, when a whole bunch of folk who used to work on farms in cottage industries were actually shunted into cities. And in the Victorian England time, in life conditions that were worse than slavery in some cases, abysmal. And, the real question was, why are we doing this ourselves to make a handful of folk outlandishly and obscenely rich? It was a good question. And it took us about 50 years to actually provide an answer. It shouldn't be like this. We all should enjoy a better life. And I must admit, I can't look at physical poverty and physical abysmal living standards across the entire globe. But I do look in a digital term at that same degree of one-sided exploitation of you and I and everyone else, just to make a small number of individuals obscenely rich without any counterforce going, this is not stable. We either go down the path of the French Revolution and, kill all the aristocracy, all the digital aristocracy, which wasn't a good idea then, as it turned out, because, that Robespierre guy, you never should have trusted. He was a nasty person from day one. But we either go down that path of social revolution with all of its attendant worse woes, or we try and curb those excesses now without it going completely out of control. And that's a conversation of our time, necessarily of today. Because if we don't talk about it, it just gets worse. And that resentment between the digitally have and the have-nots just gets starker, more bitter, and we start fighting harder, and it turns physical. And that's, what we should never go to.
The Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, also known as the ACCC, so the problem is within the power imbalance between consumers and the major digital platforms, and the consumers don't fully understand the bargain they are entering into with digital platforms when they sign up for services. What are your thoughts?
Oh, this is, you're heading into PhD territory almost at 1,000,000 miles an hour, because part of this issue is actually a talk about the regulatory structure and the structure of enterprise, which America actually first started as a conscious conversation at the time of the Sherman Act in the 1890s. The real issue is this whole issue of the public interest about safeguarding me as a consumer and my rights? Or is it actually about the nature of the industry and its foundations as being rapacious exploiters? Do we try and curb the worst excesses of industry because, as one of your Supreme Court judges said at the time, Brandeis, big is bad? It's not what they do to consumers, it's just big is bad. And that was a conversation that happened more than 100 years ago, and it's a conversation of today. Now, trying to have that conversation for regulators and politicians is excessively hard. And they retreat back into a more cozy conversation about the interest of the consumer. We're protecting the voter. And so it's quite okay for companies to do whatever they want as long as they don't abuse the consumer too much. Now, I think trying to draw that line has never worked and is not working now. And the ACCC in Australia, safeguarding the consumer interests, has actually managed to achieve very little. Now, they confidently say, but it could be worse. But I could say that about anything. It could always be worse. But it's not very good. It's not, in an absolute term, I think, where we need to be in terms of balancing the interests of me as an informed consumer with choice and having enterprises provide me with services as distinct from enterprises that tell me what I should be thinking. I think the biggest and worst problem right now, the one that no one really thinks about, is that 92% of folk use Google as search. What we think, what we regard as fact, what we regard as the foundation of our conversations in society is based on a private corporate company's view of the world. Poor old Microsoft, in order to make Bing real, in order to make it look like a real search engine rather than something random, had to actually mimic Google search. Because you and I, if we didn't see the same answer, said, Bing's rubbish. Now, how have we got to the point that our very thoughts, our conversation, our lexicon of talking to each other is actually dominated by one company, one enterprise, one framework? And I think that we've got to sit down and weep. Where was the thinking that got us to public libraries? Where was the thinking that got us to the fact there are many thoughts and many ways of expressing them? Where is that freedom in almost a monoculture of one search engine, one line of thought, one idea of what is a good result and what is a bad result? And put like that, if you're not worried, if you're not deeply depressed, I don't think you're human. It is that bad. And part of this is almost like the climate change arguments. The real question is, what can I as an individual do about this? And, that's the hard answer. I don't know. I really don't know. I am as much a victim as you and everyone else here. I know it's not right. I know that what we're doing to ourselves is deeply disturbing, and we're going to pay for it. My kids are going to pay for it. But I don't understand what measures we can do to curb that. But if we don't talk about it, we're never going to think along the lines of how do we fix it. If we don't talk about it, then there's no consequent conversation. And so I'm at least going to talk about it.
The conversation is definitely important and something that we should be talking about. I know that you are a problem finder, but I'm going to ask you the solution anyways, just based on Crompton disagreed with the ACCC. And so the solution was to quote, things being made safe thanks to a third party, writing safety rules or standards to specify how things should be done, think building codes, automotive and aviation safety standards, accounting rules, and so on. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I've never thought of it that way, but in some ways, we have no idea what safe code is. We have no idea what good code is. We have no idea of what is, if you will, a socially responsible good application versus a somewhat insidious and evil one. We just don't know. And so there's a whole myriad of levels. Is the code robust? Can it be deflected to do something bad in unintentional ways? Well, that's problem number one. Will the car crash on its own accord? But there's this second kind of conversation about is, putting 1 million cars on a poor city's roads twice a day good for anyone? And during this sort of lockdown, we've actually been looking at a different life where none of us spend an hour each sort of side of the working day driving from one location to another and back again for no particular good purpose. Now, in the code world, where is that argument about what is good and what is bad? We don't understand. And so it's fine, like Malcolm, to argue, well, we should do a better job. I agree. But trying to understand what that actually means when you take mechanical worlds and try and translate them into virtual is much, much harder. Yeah, the airline industry. The plane should take off. It should stay in the air while you want it to stay in the air. And it should come down gently, not violently. Within those parameters, knock yourselves out, but stay within the rails. Keep within those parameters. What's the parameters for code? And it's sort of, I don't know. Does anyone know? You're looking at an activity that, I don't know, is one generation old. It took us more than 100 years to get used to the telephone. And even then, I'm not sure we really did. You're asking a lot really, really quickly. The downside is, of course, if we don't do something now, this problem gets, 10 times worse every decade. It just gets bigger and bigger. The longer we wait to think of the right answer, the harder it is to maybe find one because it's so big. But I could not be so brave as to say I know what to do. I really don't. I'm overwhelmed by that one. I did a talk about the internet.
Yeah.
No, I did a talk on the Internet of Things, and it was sort of, well, what can we do to fix it, Geoff? And the answer was, well, I'm just telling you what the problem is, because if I knew how to fix it, I'd tell you. I'd say, well, this is my view on how to fix it. I really don't know, because we can scratch at the edges, but it's so easy to sort of figure out it's just scratching at the edges. It's not actually taking to heart the issue that the product that works in the marketplace is the cheapest product. And so my television has an entire IP stack in it. It probably has a root password. I can't get to it. I can't pull the screen off and find underneath it, a piece of software and some ROM and so on and actually make it better. I can't. It's sort of so deeply embedded, I can't do anything about it. And it's that kind of problem with the Internet of Things, for example. So how do I fix that? And the answer is, I wish I knew. And I don't.
What do you think of states getting involved so far? I know that Canada just passed a bill regulating internet. What are your thoughts on that?
There are these stages of understanding a cataclysm. And once you fully appreciate, because the first is blissful ignorance, problem, what problem? But the second one is the dramatic overreaction of, we must do something. Well, what should we do? I don't know, something. Sort of, let's do something. Why? Because that seems like we're on the ball and we're doing something. And so the first reaction of politicians is actually to do something. But in so many ways, that first reaction is inevitably wrong, misguided, and does its own amount of damage. We're seeing, if you will, the next wave in the way we viewed the internet. The first wave was actually almost the stateless, who was it? The new laws of the cyber world. Perry Barlow? Someone will know. Out there in whatever universe this is going to, someone will remember that declaration of cyber independence. We were going to break down national states. This whole thing had no geography. It was all about all of us together because communication was so easy. And we're finding the blowback right now because what we're actually finding is that the whole nation state is still there. And quite frankly, I was so impressed when Paul Vixie came to a number of meetings, I think including NANOL, talking about the Treaty of Westphalia in Europe in 1648, the rise of the nation state, and pointed out it was still a critical part of our thinking today. And so when we built this stateless internet, the whole idea of the nation state didn't go away. But what nation states have started to realise is they're now critically dependent on each other to make their own nation work. The DNS, routing, and it's abysmally easy, frighteningly easy for one nation, appropriately resourced, appropriately expertised, to make life difficult, not just for some other nation, but potentially for all other nations. And nations are desperately worried. They're worried at a strategic level, at a commercial level, at a personal consumer level. All aspects of this sort of go, well, we're not in control, are we? And the answer is, well, no, you're not. And so the immediate gut reaction is regulate. Try and make sure that data never leaves the border. Try and make sure that Google something. Just try and make sure. And so we kind of had this sort of GDPR gut reaction where no matter where you are in the world, if a European citizen gets damaged, there are consequences. Effective? Nah. Was it seen to be doing something? Well, yes, it did something. Was it effective? It's arguable. Probably not, I think. History will go, nice try, but not. And so, yes, Canada, yes, Australia, yes, Russia, yes, China, yes, the United States. And all of them are trying to bring back a strong degree of nationalism, which is almost a complete spin around to the internet as it was seen 20 years ago, where Ira Magaziner with Bill Clinton tried to declare the internet not only a tax-free zone, but as a border-free zone, and trying to promote to other countries, let's not worry about all the old ITU rules. They just don't matter in the internet. We've rejected that now, and we're now overreacting the other way.
So what is most concerning to the average internet consumer today?
Look, I can go down to any pub and have a fine conversation, and as soon as we get into an argument, I can whip out my phone, punch in Google search and resolve it instantly. I can get the world's libraries at my fingertips, in my pocket. All my mail, all my work, all my shopping. And bizarrely, most of it's free. I don't pay for search. This astonishing infrastructure that costs somebody, Google, a huge amount of money, I don't pay for. I don't pay for my mail. I don't pay for my documents. I don't pay for any of this. So why should I worry? I have never had it so good, is one view. And what I've sold is almost like this sort of Faustian pact. I've sold something I could never have sold individually. I've sold my profile. I've sold my future purchasing decisions. I've sold my thoughts. But I've sold it to an aggregator who's managed to combine me with, a few billion others and create what have appeared to be one of the most valuable companies in the world. Google advertising funded Behemoth. But I could never have taken my assets out and said, no, Geoff's auctioning his future purchases right here, right now, come and pay. Joke, right? And so oddly enough, this really insidious situation we find ourselves in is actually one where the consumer you and I are actually sitting there going, what is wrong with this picture for us? Have not these companies trying to understand and cater to my every need? As Hal Varian, Internet's chief economist at one point, many years ago, pointed out, spam and all this stuff, it's only spam because it's a failure of information. If they really understood me, it wouldn't be an ad. It'd be a friendly, helpful suggestion. Hey, Geoff, time for a coffee. Just at the time where I'm thinking, it would be time for a coffee right now. Thank you. And so, it's hard to actually understand why my life is impoverished given this excess of catering to me. And this is, again, why the debate is so difficult. I can't point to, all of us living in abject poverty wondering where the next meal's coming from. That's not the poverty of the digital age, at least in Western democracies. It's a different kind of poverty that I think has a greater attendant risk of catastrophic failure. We're just out further on the edge. This is sad. I'm sorry. In some ways, these are deep and difficult topics. And if someone's still hanging along inside the webcast, great. Love to have you here. But by God, it's not comforting stories, is it?
It's not comforting stuff, but I think it's important to what you're doing, that you're saying this, right? Because just as if we keep looking away and keeping our heads buried in the sand, this doesn't get solved either. So even though it is uncomfortable to talk to, and it is a gloomy and dark conversation as we're having now of like this mounting problem that's just getting bigger and bigger that no one is solving. If we don't have these conversations, it just gets bigger. And so I commend you for being this person, right? We have to have people like this. We have to have the person that gets up at the back of the room and says, wait, there's a problem. The bird doesn't have clothes, man. It doesn't have clothes.
It just goes into failure modes, which gets a lot worse. You're quite right. So yes, it is. And, yes, as we said at the start, it's a job I enjoy. I take perverse delight in being the contrarian, yes. Some of us do. It's so dull to just agree with everyone. A good debate is when there are differences of opinion. Other than that, it's just all mass cheering. Yeah.
Yeah, nobody wants to be an echo chamber, right? Or I guess there are some people, but it makes for a lot better conversation when we're not.
I make a lousy echo chamber. I make a lousy team player. Everyone who's worked with me knows that. And my apologies to all my co-workers over the years, yeah.
In your talk about the evolution of DNS at our NANOG 82 meeting, you spoke about the problem of being overly reliant and the problem of there not being a, quote, untapped financial return to fix the DNS, saying people change things only when there is money in it. Can we talk more about this?
Right. You see, I work in the infrastructure business in IP addresses in APNIC. And infrastructure is something that everyone needs, everybody. We all need IP addresses. And interestingly, we all need DNS. Everyone needs it, but no one's actually prepared to pay for it. And so the DNS is one of these orphans. Where do I get my DNS resolution from? Well, typically it's my internet service provider. Why do they do it? Because no one else can do it for money. I don't pay to get my queries resolved. You don't pay for it. No one pays for it. And so what actually happens is, a bit like the Internet of Things in some ways, the infrastructure sort of settles down into the cheapest possible way of doing this that serves the answer. And so from an ISP point of view, the DNS is a cost department. It's not a revenue department. I can't, as we've tried from time to time, change the answers. You get frowny faces. As soon as you try and substitute, hey, that's not a domain, come to my search engine and I'll tell you where to go, you get a lot of frowny faces. If you start substituting answers, hey, you don't want that Google, try Geoff's new Google, frowny faces. And so the DNS, it's almost impossible to turn into a revenue raiser. And so it gets suppressed into being Mr. Cost down in the basement. Folk don't upgrade their engines. They don't upgrade their software. We've seen queries, A6 queries in the DNS that go back to Noah's Ark. You know, we deprecated that technology, in the first 2 weeks of thinking about V6. All of this stuff is still sitting there. Now, we're impatient at the same time. And in particular, what you're seeing is the value chain has moved on. We used to make money out of putting wires in the ground, the telephony company. We moved on from that into switching the data, the router company. We moved on from that into making platforms give us money. So whether it was Windows or Apple's Mac or iOS, the platform was all controlling. These days, the money spinner is apps and content. Nothing else matters. So all the money, those top 10 companies, or 9 out of the top 10, are actually companies that are content, not carriage. They're impatient. They ride the technology wave harder than anyone else. They are deeply involved in the digital privacy argument. They are deeply involved in better encryption, better infrastructure. They want the DNS to be, if you will, a lot more solid than the leaky, marginally reliable horse and buggy thing it is today across most of the internet. And the frustrating thing is they know what to do. We have designed DNS over HTTP3. We can make this rock solid. We can actually get the DNS to the point where you can't see. You just can't. And in some ways, we've also made the DNS really scary, because these days the queries are not about, hey, what's the IP address of that name? It's, how should I connect to this service run by this company? Where's the local cloud rendezvous point, and what credentials should I present to that cloud rendezvous point to get to the service I want? So the DNS query is telling anyone who cares to look what I'm about to do in the next millisecond. It's the best, if you will, intent engine we have. So protecting it is really important. So what I'd like is for everyone to do this. Now, I don't know about you, but over there behind me somewhere is some lousy modem. And in that lousy modem is a DNS resolver that the modem manufacturer probably paid, 50 cents for a license. The code was written by somebody, I don't know where, for about, $1 an hour at the time. And they're long since dead or whatever, because it's really old code. Who's going to upgrade it? Who's going to pay to upgrade it? Is Google or Amazon or Microsoft going to pay to upgrade that because they want their apps to actually use a more modern version of the DNS? The answer is they're not. So it's up to me, is it? But I know nothing about the DNS. I'm just a consumer. It's just a box I bought down at the local store, Walmart, wherever. What's the problem? It does the job. The internet works. Why should I buy a better one? And so the folk who are moving fast don't want to pay to bring everyone up to speed. They don't want to, if you will, do the transition from narrow gauge railway to wide gauge railway for everyone. They just want to do it for their own railway lines. They don't want to pay for everyone. And so they want to move fast, but because they can't afford to get everyone else along with them, they just want to get themselves out. So they're going to go down application technologies that lift their part of the DNS out from the common pool, going, well, that's your DNS. Sucks to be you and all that, but see you later. This is my DNS, and I'm in control now. I have the money, the wherewithal, and the motivation, because that's where the money is, up in the apps world, to do this right for me and the people who use my service. Everyone else has a problem. It's the same thing that's actually played out without much mention in the Chrome browser. We have a huge amount of trouble with the web PKI. And most of the savage attacks that have happened where countries try to eavesdrop on their citizens has been by putting in fake corrupted certificates and trying to get people's machines to believe these fake certificates, so they hand their Gmail credentials to, the surveillance organization run by that country. China and Egypt colluded to eavesdrop on Egyptian citizens some years ago, and we saw it in Iran also, right? How did Google react? Well, what Google did is it changed the code of Chrome to make that impossible. But it made it impossible. It made it impossible if you used Chrome and went to Google. If you went anywhere else, there was no protection because they'd coded in protection for Google. Sucks to be everyone else. And we all looked at this and went, yay, well, It's not brilliant, but it's okay. But what was going on is we were splitting the world apart, and folk were building their own defences, their own Norman castles, going, we're protected. Gee, it's really bad out there. We're protected. And we're going to find this again and again in this world, in the DNS in particular, that it starts to fall apart, that it's not a single cohesive naming technology anymore. It'll start to move out as the folk with money and agenda solve their problem in their way, and everyone else is kind of meh. So now the DNS is not a library in your platform. It's not a resolver run by your ISP. They still exist. But if I ran, say, the Mozilla browser in the United States, its DNS queries get taken elsewhere. Independently of the platform, independently of the ISP, it goes to Cloudflare. You don't know, you can't control it. That bit of the DNS went elsewhere. Now, at the moment, the answers coming from Cloudflare aren't Mozilla contexted. But what if Geoff's own browser sends queries using DNS over HTTPS to Geoff's own resolver? And I have money, I'm a content person, I have all the money in the world. And what if Geoff's own resolver creates names that are Geoff's own names? Only visible. And you kind of go, well, that'll never happen. Look at Apple's latest announcement in their Worldwide Developer Conference about having customized domain names for Apple email. And tell me that isn't DNS fragmentation, because it is. Now, it's nicely cloaked and packaged up. It looks so convenient, but those names don't exist outside their ecosystem. And that's the fragmentation that starts to pull a single cohesive environment apart. And we should worry about that. And the reason why is it's sort of this really deep question, which seems so simple. What's the internet? How do I know when I'm on it? Now, if I asked you that question 20 years ago, you'd go, well, I've got an IP address and it's a real one. You know, it's a genuine, unique one. I got it from an RIR. I'm the only person with that IP address. I can reach everybody. Everyone can reach me. I'm on the internet. So it was an address-based argument because there was one address base. These days, wherever you might be, you're behind the NAT. And you're as likely to be on net 10 as I am. There is no single address plan. We broke it. We're never going to get it back. I'm sorry, V6 people, it's over, right? Gone, done, dusted, never coming back. So what's the internet today? Well, it's the namespace. The only thing that defines us as being one internet is actually being able to trade names, URLs with each other. I've just seen a really good website. It's this URL. You can see it too. Now, if I can't do that anymore, if the name that I'm looking at is not the name that you have, what have we got left? You know, and the real answer is, oh, geez, I'm sorry, we broke it. And the point about this area of DNS evolution is that our pace to try and move the edge and the leading edge so fast out beyond common infrastructure is ripping the infrastructure apart. And you'll see inside many circles this constant story around fragmentation, that what's going on is that these sort of commercial marketplace pressures are actually leaving the cohesion behind. And if we leave it too far behind, it's going to get lost, the same way that we lost address cohesion. V6 was important. It preserved address coherency. We left it too late and didn't do it fast enough. We lost it. We replaced it with a dependence on names. And, you know, guess what? We're about to rip it apart. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. What do we do next? And there's no clear answers.
So on a more positive note,
all right.
This interview, what are some of the current projects that engineers are working to keep the internet functional?
This is a really hard question because we have some remarkably good technologies that have taken years to not get anywhere. I actually think one of the landmark technologies was putting security in the DNS, because the DNS was always seen as just a playpen for lies and liars, that substituting other names was not just a pastime for various people, whether they were malicious or not, but pastime for countries You can't get to that domain name. It's censored in my country. And trying to make sure that the DNS isn't a playpen for liars and liars, and lying, was actually important. DNSSEC is important. And the battle to try and actually make it get used has proved almost intractable. And part of the problem is we're getting this age-old trade-off between a better technology and a really, really fast technology. If you want the $1 billion nanosecond, you can't have security in the DNS. It's just, I can't do that quickly. Good security takes time, effort, protocol, whatever. And so this effort of trying to make it go faster but go better is hitting these fundamental, design technologies. There's another fascinating area around what we call HTTP3 these days, a piece of work by Google called Quick, of actually masking transport from carriage. The TCP session was always visible. The control parts of a flow was always visible to the provider. Providers got pretty savvy, particularly when we put it on mobiles, and they started playing with people's TCP settings in the middle, making them go faster or slower. Did you spend more money with me? I'll let you go faster. Are you a cheap budget customer? Well, it sucks to be you. Let me change your TCP parameters. And so Google decided, right, what we're going to do is bed it down behind a wall of encryption. It actually makes the internet a better place. It actually puts more control in end systems. It actually lets us get on better with each other, but savagely resisted by a huge amount of the industry, who sort of sees their one point of leverage and control disappearing behind the encryption wall. And, it's just one more big battle, if you will, between what we do today and what folk would like to do tomorrow. And inevitably, as in all these battles, the ultimate winner is money. And the application folk, we all understand, is where the money is. Ultimately, what they want, like Google, is what we get. And everyone else is sort of sitting there going, well, okay, what just happened to us? Well, money happened to us.
So what are some more interesting current trends you've seen that might have a chance at solving, as you say, our busted internet?
The major trend is the appification of the internet. And I'm not sure that it solves the internet. I'm not sure it even helps the internet. But it is where we are going. We've moved from carriage to platform all the way up into applications and content. And that content economy and the content app now drives everything. And that's kind of a big issue because in some ways networks are now commodities. It's just a piece of wire in the ground. VPNs really don't care. In fact, I would actually say the enterprise market is the last horse and carriage market out there. If you still run equipment in your basement, it's very quaint and we think it's amusing, but you're wasting your time and your money. If you haven't clouded this stuff up, and not just clouded your servers, but clouded the service and got rid of the service, that quite frankly, if you're not moving in that same value chain up into defining our digital world as these sort of customized little automata engines, the applications, that is sort of where we are at. Everything else is now just irrelevant. And so, what's going on with all that? Well, we're seeing a huge amount of service and reliability move up into that point, and everything else doesn't matter. Everything else doesn't matter. And so even the whole arguments about routing and peering and transit, there's none left. No one moves their packets around the world. I just sort of look over the horizon and find the closest data center, and that gives me all my data. How did it get there? Google, Facebook, somebody, they did stuff. Great. But interestingly, what they do inside their networks isn't necessarily a standard. It certainly isn't necessarily the public internet. It's actually their business. And they're now big enough to define that business in their own terms. And I suppose, somewhat depressingly, if you squint a bit and look hard, we've recreated the telephone department. All you see is the handset, everything else is a mystery. And these days, all you see is the app, everything else is a mystery. And then so true to type, we've sort of gone back to this, well, this is the way the industry likes to operate. And they're doing it again. But now it's not a national monopoly. It's not AT&T anymore. These are global. There's only a very small number and they're everywhere.
So let's talk about APNIC.
Yep.
What is APNIC doing right now for teaching technical skills, and what sort of research are you working on right now?
in the same way that in the 1950s, there was a huge amount of education around roads, railways, dams, civil infrastructure, power systems, to sort of get everyone up to speed on what civil engineering and civil plant was all about. This digital world requires a sophisticated digital infrastructure, and it's not just build it once and it's all good and fine. It's build it continuously. Try and make sure that you're not losing national opportunities, and whether you're Bhutan or Mongolia or Australia or the United States, keeping your infrastructure up to date means keeping your expertise and skills up to date. Being a training college for some other nation's market doesn't serve you well. And so we do a lot of work in that area of trying to actually make sure that folk in all kinds of countries in our part of the world have access to today's information, and not just a textbook of 20 years ago about this is the way the internet was, but sort of trying to understand what you need to do and what skills need to be there today to actually be part of that and contribute to a national infrastructure. And so, yes, APNIC spends a lot of time in training and development, but, that's not my role. My role is different. I first started off, because we're a policymaker about who gets addresses and why. There was a big debate about, well, these people get in a room a few times a year and make policy. But the real question is, did they give the right answers? Is it working? Is this self-interest or common interest? How well did it work? And so I was sort of looking at the feedback between what the policies were and how the internet behaves. What's that correlation? And that's sort of been, I feel, the major thrust of this. And, is IPv6 a goer? Is it not? Is security a goer? And what's this whole issue about address security when we're talking about routing the world and folk doing nasty things in routing? And so I've spent an enormous amount of time over more than 10 years working inside the BGP and security frameworks, trying to understand how well we're going, what's missing and what's working. And that's a continuing piece of work. But most of my effort today is in measurement. We tell ourselves lies. V6 is deployed, it's fine. Lie. DNSSEC is everywhere. Lie. V6 fragmentation works. Well, that's a lie. What do you mean by lie, Geoff? Well, let's look at the entire internet and see where it works and where it doesn't. Let's go down to the level of the network provider and talk about their quality of service that they offer in terms of technology. And so I've spent a huge amount of my time over the last 10 years inside APNIC, where we're an advertiser. We went to the dark side, sorry. But the advertisement is rather weird, that it doesn't actually try and sell anything. But inside that advertisement is a script. And what that script does is measure the capabilities of the browser to actually do things. Can you get to this URL if you can only got V6? Here's a URL. The DNS name looks fine, but if you try DNSSEC, it's a lie. Here's a really big packet. Can you do fragmentation? And trying to understand that if you're a customer of Charter or a customer of Telstra, you might get very different answers because their network has been constructed with different technologies. And if you were doing this in 2015 versus today, again, there might be very different answers. We need to know this. We need to understand not just the big average number for the world, but actually who's doing this better than others? What approaches are working? Because I think that's important these days to understand that. One of our big mistakes in V6 was to fall down the trap that said, as long as I've got 30 different ways to do this transition, we're fine, because choice is everything. And the other approach was, as long as we've got 30 different ways of doing this, everyone's confused and no one's going to do anything. Choice is not necessarily the right answer here. And trying to understand that feedback between, well, you made this choice decision. Over in America, T-Mobile went with a technology called 464XLAP. Does it work? Is it effective? Does it give a reliable and robust service? Versus others who went dual stack light, i.e. Comcast, or even full dual stack, Verizon. What gives better performance? Now, those are great questions that we actually need answers to. But trying to find those answers is difficult because measuring all of the internet all of the time is tough. we stumbled upon advertising because, bizarrely, and I suppose depressingly too, ads are everywhere. From the Faroe Islands through Chad, all the way to where you are in Colorado, you get ads. Ads are everywhere. And ads actually help us understand measuring this system and understand how we're going. And so that's been most of my work and continues to be most of my work.
Definitely a lot of things to think about, Geoff. Do you have anything to add to our Nanog community in building the internet of tomorrow?
I actually thought almost from its inception as regional techs that Nanog was a template for a different way of working that other professional groups sort of stumbled on in a more structured way. The Institute of Engineers, the College of Surgeons. We found ourselves as a more informal group right from the start with a common interest that transcended who we worked for. And it was, we're all jockeying routers at the time. We're all building networks. We're all doing the same thing. And the vendors and us are actually not against each other. We're in the same camp trying to deploy relatively, complex technologies. And there's a lot of a conversation to go on. Nanog created an open community that actually really did provide a template for almost everywhere else in the world to have those same conversations. And its maturing over the years has been amazing. And as I said before, they're a friendly group. They're one of the two most friendliest operating groups on the planet, yay New Zealand, yay Nanog. And they've managed to sort of combine, I think, that essential element of being part of a group of folk who are not just your professional colleagues, but also your friends through common interest. And do so in a way that's fun, that's friendly, that if you will reinforces and helps you professionally and personally through all this. I certainly, don't agree with every posting on the Nanog mailing list. I've yet to find a human being who possibly could. But I find it stimulating and interesting. Bits I agree with, bits I don't. Great, that point of view, the community in Nanog is amazing. And I still think it's one of the standards in terms of trying to build it elsewhere in the globe. And APNIC has certainly been trying to help others to do this in various places, both mainstream and out of the way. And as ever, Nanog remains a very, very helpful template, not just in its meetings, but in publishing and making available the videos, in creating an open environment that other folk can look at and participate and to some point bring back into their own languages and cultures. And so, top marks, this is valuable. It's really valuable. It's valuable to the folk who are in it, and I think it's valuable to the industry itself. It gives us a sense of knowing what we're doing outside our day job and into our chosen profession without being hung up on the professional qualifications. We've actually managed to make this more of, it's not a lifestyle, but it's certainly a way of looking at this sort of engineering operational task that we share with all other folk in Nanog. So, it's a great piece of work.
Well, I'm sure I speak on behalf of all Nanog teammates. Thank you. That's great, especially coming from a man like you. We really appreciate that. Geoff, it has been wonderful. I mean, I know that I have a lot to think about tonight. I'm going to actually Google a lot of what we talked about. Really, what is incredible about you is that you get the conversation going. You stimulate my mind, a lot of other people's. And so I appreciate you and what you're doing out in the world, and keep on doing it.
Thank you very much. And my thanks and appreciation for my own experiences of being part of the Nanog community over, is it 30 years? Oh my God, 30 years. Cool. Thank you very much.